The last light turned out. Most of the families in the city had gone to sleep, hoping to escape the dark world they currently lived in. A majority of these families struggled to cope with the drastic changes they were faced with, for the world had flipped on its head. The peaceful quiet was shredded to pieces as sirens wailed out, warning the people of the dangers the skies now presented. The city seemed to light up as everyone rushed to escape their homes. People poured out of buildings, frightened for their lives. The goal? The subway tunnels, or any other underground structure. That's when it began to rain. The street began to shake, and buildings began to blow apart as thousands of bombs and incendiaries fell from the black night sky. Most people, luckily, had made it to safety, but there were always ones who didn't. In the morning, the people of the city would leave safety to go out about their lives again. Many did not have homes to return to. Bombings like these would reoccur almost every night for 8 months. Welcome to Britain. This is Beyond the Battlefield. Most Americans struggle to sympathize with the rest of the world. The United States has so many luxuries that its people take for granted, and overall the nation itself is safe. Pearl Harbor and the 9/11 attacks were horrific events we Americans had to face. Other countries face events like these every day. In World War II, the world had to face darkness and despair as people began to turn on one another. Most European nations had their fair share of fighting during this conflict, and they all fought in their own backyards. Many people died in their own backyards. Great Britain is known as one of the three Allied superpowers during the Second World War, and consisted of England, Scotland, and Wales. After France was invaded by Germany, Britain was under the constant threat of a full-scale invasion for months. If the Germans could take over Britain, they would crush a major threat to their empire and take over the entirety of Western Europe in one swipe. Using ports on the western coastline of mainland Europe, Germany launched dozens of U-boats, or torpedo-armed submarines, towards the west. These U-boats slowly surrounded Britain, destroying any ships going in or out of the nation. This included supply ships, meaning Britain was cut off from the rest of the world. The island that was once thought of as a barrier against invasion soon became the reason for their isolation. The British were alone, and with German forces surrounding them, they had nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. Britain's war machine sprang to life as the production of every possible weapon began. The recent conflict in France had left the British short of countless aircraft and land weapons, forcing them to manufacture new ones to replace them. Every man and woman available was to support the war effort. Agricultural production increased, along with rationing, recycling, and overall unification between the British peoples. Factories pumped out weapons of war in the hopes that these weapons would save their country. Draftings began, and a massive spike in volunteer soldiers formed. The will and determination of the Brits were futile, however, when the German Luftwaffe became involved. The Reichsmarschall of the German military knew that Britain's forces were decimated after the invasion of France, and believed that Britain could be forced into surrender with air power alone. Reichsmarschall is German for Marshal of the Reich, and is the leader of all the German military. At the Reichsmarschall's disposal were 2,000 operational aircraft, all of which he would later throw relentlessly at Britain. Meanwhile, The British Royal Air Force, aka the RAF, had only 700 operational aircraft available after the fall of France. In early summer, the German Luftwaffe, or Air Force, began striking at shipping lanes in the English Channel, the strip of water separating Western Europe from Great Britain. From there, the Luftwaffe destroyed many ports on the south side of England, resulting in heavy ship and aircraft losses for the British. The Battle of Britain had begun. Despite the 3-to-1 ratio the Luftwaffe had over the British had two elements on their side. The first one was radar. Radar, the full name being radio direction and ranging, would transmit pulses of radio energy into the sky. If it hit an object, usually a fighter or bomber plane, the energy would bounce off the object back to the radar transmitter, resulting in a ping being displayed on the view screen. This ping would show the exact location of that object. This was especially useful at night, when most fighter pilots couldn't see well in the dark sky. The Reichsmarschall of the German military underestimated the effectiveness and importance of British radar, giving the Royal Air Force a second advantage: the element of surprise. On August 15th of 1940, the Reichsmarschall attacked over a dozen targets across Britain with every aircraft he had available. Fighting ensued across Britain. Anti-aircraft guns pounded relentlessly as they tried to shoot down dozens of German fighters and bombers. German and British fighters clashed in the skies, while German bombers decimated the ground below. After the engagement, only 34 RAF fighters had been destroyed, along with 13 pilots. The assistance given by radar had successfully minimized casualties, while delivering a shocking blow to the Luftwaffe. The Germans had lost 69 aircraft and 190 aircrew. The tides had finally turned. The Battle of Britain was a fistfight between the British RAF and Germany's Luftwaffe. Both sides took turns exchanging blows against each other. Still determined to destroy the RAF, the German Reichsmarschall focused his attacks against the sector stations of a British air group. During these strikes, the Germans had devastated the stations. Both sides had now received powerful blows, and both were beginning to crumble. In only a few days after August, the Luftwaffe had lost another 125 aircraft. The British weren't faring any better. Despite receiving several hundred more aircraft from production, the RAF were running out of pilots to fly them. Both sides were losing, but the Germans were dead set on finishing the fight. Luftwaffe intelligence believed that the Brits had only 100 fighters left, which led the Reichsmarschall to launch a massive daylight air raid. On September 15th, 31 days after the Luftwaffe had attacked over a dozen targets in Britain, the Germans were surprised to encounter over 300 British fighters. Losing 55 aircraft, the Luftwaffe had finally given up. The RAF, despite crippling losses, had gained air superiority over Britain. The Battle of Britain was over. Fearing the potential of more bombings and attacks from the Luftwaffe, the British developed the idea of Operation Pied Piper. In order to keep the children of Britain safe from more potential bombings, children from countless major cities were sent to the safer British countryside. Back on September 1st of 1940, hundreds of thousands of British children waved goodbye to their family members and friends as they rode trains to their new homes. Upon arrival, the British children were distributed to adult strangers in the British countryside. Some were lucky enough to be given to family or friends, while most others were given to total strangers. These were hard times for everyone. Parents had to give away their children. Kids had to be detached from their parents and move in with strangers. and people in the countryside were rapidly changed into foster parents for 2 to even 6 children they had never met before. Life changed for so many, and many British families felt heavy pain in their hearts. However, it was a sacrifice worth making when the Luftwaffe began to bomb British cities. On September 7th, the bombings of British cities had begun. Known as the Blitz to the British people, these bombings lasted for months on end. In the beginning, Britain was bombed almost every night from September 7th to November 12th. The British only witnessed 10 peaceful, bombless nights in those 2 months. These bombings lessened after the fall, but continued all the way until late spring of 1941. After months of ruthless bombings, the British began to inflict heavier casualties on the German bombers. In April, British AA guns had shot down 17 bombers, and RAF fighters had destroyed another 22. However, Hitler had changed his priorities. He was preparing for the invasion of the Soviet Union after reviewing combat reports of the Russian and Finnish conflict. Hitler had decided one last raid would take place against Britain before reassigning most of the Luftwaffe to the Eastern Front. This raid had decimated 1/3 of London, the capital of Britain. Thousands of civilians had lost their homes. The Blitz was finally over. Britain had survived. Morale was high, and Britain was ready to strike back against the Germans. I'm your host, Gabriel Brubacher. The script, graphics, and podcast are all created by me, with music provided by WeVideo and additional sound effects from freesound.com. Most information from the Smithsonian World War II Dictionary. This episode was a broad overview of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, so if you desire more information about this subject, feel free to do further research on your own. An amazing historical fiction I would personally recommend is The War That Saved My Life by Kimberly Brubacher Bradley. This book takes on the personal outlook of a girl during Operation Pied Piper and focuses on the struggles of British children during World War II. This fascinating story had almost left me in tears after I read it. Make sure to tune in to the next episode of Beyond the Battlefield.